You have until the end of this dinner to sign, or you're done. My brother-in-law Daniel's voice was quiet. That was the worst part. Not a shout, not a threat dressed up in volume. Just a flat corporate calm that made the wine glasses on the long oak table seem to tremble. Outside the windows of the Whitmore estate, snow was falling in heavy curtains over the frozen lake, the way it always does in February in Muskoka. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the smell of roast lamb and cedar candles filled the dining room. It should have felt like home. It never did. I looked down at the document in front of me. 12 pages, single-spaced, bound with a blue legal clip. A deed of assignment, transferring my 40% share of the Whitmore Family Cottage Trust into a numbered holding company, registered in Alberta. My late husband James's family had built this property over 3 generations. He had left his share to me. That had been the original sin, as far as his family was concerned. My mother-in-law Patricia sat at the head of the table watching me with the patient expression of someone who had already decided how the evening would end. She was 71, thin as birch bark, with the same ice-blue eyes as James. Beside her, Daniel, 44, her eldest, was already pouring himself a second glass of Bordeaux. His wife Suzanne sat to his right, not looking at me, picking at the edge of her dinner roll. And at the far end, my sister-in-law Caroline, 38, who had barely spoken to me in the 3 years since James died, was staring at her phone under the tablecloth like a teenager. I was the only one who had been asked to come alone. "I haven't read it yet," I said. Daniel set down his glass. "Rachel, we've been over this. The trust is a liability. It needs to be consolidated before the spring filing. This is not personal. Then why isn't your lawyer here?" A pause. Patricia touched the string of pearls at her throat. "We wanted to do this as a family," she said. "We thought you'd appreciate that." I looked at the document again. I thought about all the times I had sat at this table and been made to feel like a guest who had stayed too long. The holiday dinners where Caroline would tell stories about James's childhood that carefully, deliberately excluded the 12 years he and I had been together. The summer-long weekends where Daniel made offhand comments about how I must find the maintenance costs a lot to manage on a teacher's salary. The condolence cards after the funeral that had been addressed only to Patricia, as though I were an afterthought. A footnote. They had never understood what James saw in me. A high school English teacher from Sudbury, no family money, no connections, no pedigree. They had tolerated me while he was alive because they had no choice. Now they were consolidating. I picked up the pen. Patricia exhaled softly. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Suzanne looked up from her roll. I held the pen for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Then I set it down on top of the document without signing. "I'm not signing this tonight," I said. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Tighter. Colder. "Rachel." Daniel's voice had dropped a register. "I want to be very clear with you. If you refuse to cooperate with this restructuring, we will be forced to pursue legal remedies. We have grounds to challenge James's bequest on the basis of undue influence. It will be expensive, it will be public, and it will not go well for you." I looked at him steadily. "Is that a threat?" "It's a projection," he said, smiling thinly. "Before I tell you what happened next and why 3 RCMP officers and 2 investigators from the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada were standing in Patricia's living room before dessert was served, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I want to know how far across this country this story travels. Had you ever sat across from people who smiled at you while they tried to take everything? Drop it below, because tonight we are not signing anything. Tonight we are auditing." I reached into my coat, which was draped over the back of my chair, and I placed a manila envelope on the table. Not thrown, not dramatic. I set it down deliberately the way you set down a check at closing. "What is this?" Patricia asked. "Open it," I said. Daniel reached for it first, the way he always reached for everything that wasn't his. He pulled out the first document. I watched his eyes move across the top line. I watched the confidence drain from his face, the way color drains from a space, the way color drains from a sky before a storm. It was not a legal challenge. It was a letter of acquisition. "You'll notice," I said, folding my hands on the table, "that the letterhead is Cartwright Capital Partners. That's a private equity firm headquartered in Toronto. They specialize in hospitality assets, real estate trusts, and distressed family holdings." Daniel was still reading. His jaw had gone tight. Cartwright Capital has been quietly acquiring debt from creditors connected to Whitmore Property Group over the past 14 months, I continued. Your commercial renovation loans from TD, the deferred interest on the Collingwood build, the receivables from the Huntsville development that stalled. They purchased all of it at a discount. The total outstanding with penalties comes to just over $4.3 million. Caroline looked up from her phone. Cartwright Capital Partners, I said, is mine. I founded it 7 years ago. Patricia's hand stopped moving on her pearls. While you were telling your friends at Rosedale that your daughter-in-law was a schoolteacher who had married above herself, I was building a real estate investment portfolio that now manages $230 million in assets across Ontario and British Columbia. James knew. James was proud. He was the only one I ever told because he was the only one who would have celebrated it instead of trying to take it. Suzanne made a small sound, something between a laugh and a gasp. That's not possible, Daniel said. The words came out flat, stripped of everything. Check your email, I told him. I sent the SEDAR filings at 4 o'clock this afternoon. They're public record. He pulled out his phone. His face as he scrolled was something I will carry with me for a long time. Not satisfaction exactly. More like relief. The relief of finally being seen accurately after years of being seen wrong. The $4.3 million in consolidated debt, I said, turning to Patricia, is due in full on March 15th. That's 40 days. If it isn't paid, Cartwright Capital has the right to pursue claims against the assets held as collateral, which includes the Muskoka property. Patricia stood up. She was not a woman who raised her voice. She had always achieved more with stillness. This is unconscionable, she said. You married my son. You sat at this table for 12 years, and now you're going to use his death to strip this family of everything we built? I'm going to use a legal instrument to recover what your son left me, I said, which your family has spent 3 years trying to take back. For a moment, the room was completely still. The fire popped once in the hearth. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Then Daniel stood up and locked the door to the hallway. The sound of the deadbolt was very loud. Sit down, Rachel, he said. I did not sit down. You're not leaving until we come to an arrangement, he said. You want to play corporate games? Fine. But you're in this house, on this property, and I have James's original will, the handwritten one from 2009, before you were married, leaving everything to the family trust. Our lawyer believes it supersedes the revised will. Your lawyer is wrong, I said. That'll be for a judge to decide. He crossed his arms. In the meantime, you are going to sign that deed, or I am going to call our solicitor right now and begin injunction proceedings that will freeze every Cartwright Capital account pending the estate challenge. That will tie up your precious portfolio for 18 months minimum. How does that suit your investors? I felt the shift in the room. This was not improvised. This was rehearsed. The locked door, the mention of the handwritten will, the threat about the accounts. They had thought this through. Caroline set her phone face down on the table. Suzanne was looking at her hands. And then Patricia did something that surprised me. She sat back down, folded her hands precisely in her lap, and said in a voice as smooth as lake ice, "We also want you to know that we've spoken to the board at Lakewood Secondary, my school. A concerned parent has filed a formal complaint with the board office and copied the Ontario College of Teachers. The allegation is unprofessional conduct. The specifics are vague, intentionally so. These things tend to be." She tilted her head slightly. An investigation like that can take 6 to 8 months. Regardless of outcome, it tends to follow a person, especially in a small community. There it was. The second barrel. I looked at Patricia Whitmore, this woman who had hugged me at James's funeral and whispered that I would always be her daughter. I looked at her and understood. In the full and complete way you understand a thing you have always half known, that she had never seen me as anything other than a problem requiring a solution. This was not grief. This was not family protecting itself. This was a transaction. They needed the property. They needed the trust consolidated, and they needed me to disappear quietly. If I signed, they won. If I didn't sign, they would tie up my company and destroy my career. They had built a trap with 2 exits, and both of them led to the same place. I sat back down, and I let myself remember something I had not thought about in a long time. It was 9 years ago. James and I had just gotten their first serious term sheet from an institutional investor for what would become Cartwright Capital. We were sitting in our apartment in the annex, eating takeout on the floor because we hadn't bought a table yet, and I was terrified. Not of failing. Of what success would mean. Of having to tell his family what I had built and watching them try to claim it, or minimize it, or turn it into something they could use. James had looked at me over his container of pad dye and said, "You don't have to tell them anything until you're ready. And when you're ready, you won't need to explain yourself to anyone." I had never been ready while he was alive. I had kept that part of myself separate and protected, a room in my life with a lock on it, and James had been the only one with a key. He was gone now, and his family had just broken a window. I looked at Patricia. "The complaint to the College of Teachers," I said. "Was it filed through the board's online portal, or by registered mail?" She blanked. "I don't see how that's relevant." "It's registered with a timestamp," I said. "And it came from a device registered to this address. I know because our IT security firm ran the trace 2 hours ago after I received a courtesy notification from the board chair. She's a former client." The room went very quiet. Filing a false professional complaint to a regulatory body with intent to coerce is a criminal offense under Section 423 of the Criminal Code, I said. "It's extortion. And the message Daniel sent to your solicitor at 2:17 this afternoon, the one where he outlined this evening's strategy, including the locked door and the threat to freeze the Cartwright accounts, that message was forwarded to me at 3 o'clock by the solicitor's office. Apparently they had concerns about participating." Daniel had gone white. "I want to be very precise about something," I said, standing up again. I kept my voice level. Not cold, not angry. The same voice I used in the classroom when I needed a room to actually listen. "I did not come here tonight to take this property. I came here tonight because you invited me, and because I wanted to give you the opportunity to treat me with the basic dignity that James believed you were capable of. I gave you that chance. You spent it on this." I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and placed a second document on the table. Smaller. 1 page. "That is a release of the full debt held by Cartwright Capital against Whitmore Property Group. It requires 1 signature. Yours, Daniel. In exchange, you will withdraw the complaint to the College of Teachers within 24 hours, you will instruct your solicitor to close the estate challenge, and you will transfer clear title on my 40% share of the cottage trust within 30 days. You pay nothing. The $4.3 million disappears. The property stays in the family. I simply keep what James left me." Nobody moved. "Or," I said, picking up my coat from the back of my chair, "I leave here without signing anything. I file the extortion complaint first thing Monday morning, and we let the court spend the next 2 years sorting out who owns what. Either way, I'm done being managed." I walked toward the hallway door. Daniel was standing in front of it. For a moment, I thought he was going to stay there. I thought I had miscalculated, that the locked door had been a preview of something worse, that the geography of this house and his size and his certainty that he had always won were going to matter more than everything I had just said. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something moved across his face. He answered it. I watched him listen for approximately 8 seconds before the remaining color left his face entirely. He unlocked the door. I found out later that the call had been from his mortgage broker. One of Cartwright Capital's subsidiaries held the securitized debt on the Whitmore family's primary residence in Rosedale. That file had been reviewed that afternoon and flagged for accelerated review pending litigation risk. It was not a coincidence. I stepped into the hallway. Behind me, I could hear Patricia saying something in a low voice, and Daniel responding, and then a silence that had a different texture than all the other silences of that evening. Heavier, more permanent. I put on my coat in the front hall, under the framed photographs of 3 generations of Whitmores at the Muskoka dock. James was in several of them. In the ones from before we met, he looked like a boy performing happiness. In the later ones, the ones I recognized, he looked like himself. I paused in front of one taken the summer before he got sick. He was standing at the end of the dock in late afternoon light, laughing at something off camera, one hand raised to shield his eyes from the sun. He had no idea what was coming. Neither did I. I had spent 3 years after his death trying to mourn him inside this family's version of who he was. Sitting at their table, eating their food, absorbing their quiet diminishments, telling myself that it was grief, that they were hurting, that I owed them patience because James had loved them even when they made it hard. I was done performing that patience. The front door opened before I reached it. 2 RCMP officers stood on the front step, snow on their shoulders. Behind them, further down the drive, I could see a dark, unmarked sedan. "Ms. Cartwright?" the first officer said. "Yes, we received a complaint of forcible confinement at this address. Are you all right?" "I am now," I said. The complaint had been filed 40 minutes earlier by Cartwright Capital's general counsel, who had been monitoring a live audio feed of the evening from my phone. The moment Danielle locked the hallway door, she had called it in. I had not needed to press anything. I had simply needed to stay calm and let them finish talking. Behind me, I heard Daniel's footsteps in the hallway. The second officer stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore? We're going to need you to come outside." The investigation that followed took 4 months. The criminal code complaint for extortion and criminal harassment was filed. The false professional complaint was withdrawn within 12 hours of that evening, and a letter of retraction was sent to the College of Teachers. The estate challenge was closed. The deed for my 40% share of the cottage trust was transferred in 31 days, 1 day ahead of the deadline. The Rosedale mortgage? I left alone. I had enough. I did not attend James's anniversary memorial that spring. I sent flowers to the funeral home where his family had arranged a small private gathering with a card that said only that I was grateful for the years, which was true. I still teach at Lakewood, grade 12 English, the same as always. In September, I started a unit on the literature of inheritance, which I had never taught before, and which the students have responded to with more energy than almost anything else I have brought into that classroom. There is something in 17-year-olds that is very alive to the question of what we owe the families we come from and what we are allowed to keep for ourselves. James used to say that I was the most patient person he had ever met, and that my patience had a hard floor that most people never found because they never pushed far enough to reach it. His family found it. That night in Muskoka, I did not lose a family. I completed an audit, and what the numbers showed clearly and without ambiguity was that the account had been empty for a very long time. The debt was theirs. The future was mine. I drove back to the city alone, through the dark and the snow, the highway empty ahead of me the way it gets in February when the weather keeps everyone else home. The radio played something quiet, the heater worked, the roads were clear. For the first time in 3 years, I was not driving toward anything that belonged to someone else. There is a kind of cruelty that wears a very convincing disguise. It shows up at dinner tables and family gatherings. It speaks in measured tones and calls itself practicality. It tells you that what it's doing is for everyone's benefit, including yours. It is patient and well-dressed, and it knows exactly how much pressure to apply before you break. For years, I let that cruelty define the room I was allowed to take up in that family. Not because I was weak, because I was waiting. What happened in that Muskoka dining room was not just about a property deed or portfolio or $4.3 million in consolidated debt. It was the end result of a very long chain of choices, made by all of us over many years. Patricia chose to see a threat instead of a daughter. Daniel chose leverage over decency every single time it was available to him, and I chose, for 3 years after James died, to absorb their diminishments in silence rather than force a confrontation I wasn't ready for. Every one of those choices had a consequence. That is not a comforting idea, because it means I carry some of the weight of what that evening became. The silence I maintained was not only patience, it was also avoidance. I told myself I was protecting James's memory by keeping the peace with his family. What I was actually doing was allowing a debt of disrespect to compound with interest, month after month, until the only way to settle it was in a room with a locked door. I think about that a lot. The intelligence I had built, the portfolio, the legal preparation, the general counsel on the phone, the subsidiary holding the Rosedale mortgage, none of it would have protected me if I had not also done the harder work of understanding exactly who I was dealing with and why. That is what I mean when I think about the difference between being smart and being clear-eyed. You can be very competent and still lie to yourself about the people in front of you. I had been doing that for 3 years, telling myself they were grieving, telling myself they would come around. Clarity is more uncomfortable than intelligence, but it is the only thing that actually prepares you. And then there is the question of what you do with the patience that didn't break you. I had spent 7 years building something real in the shadows of that family's contempt, not to prove them wrong, though that was not a small thing on the night it finally mattered, but because the work itself was worth doing. That is the distinction I keep coming back to. Rachel did not build Cartwright Capital as an act of revenge. She built it because she was good at it, Because James believed in it. Because it was hers. The revenge was incidental. The integrity of the work was not. What I want to leave you with is this. The people who underestimate you are usually not making a mistake about your abilities. They are making a statement about what they need you to be. Their assessment of you has very little to do with you. The moment you understand that, really understand it and not just repeat it, is the moment the table shifts. You stop needing them to revise their opinion. You simply make sure that when the account comes due, the numbers are accurate. That night in Muskoka, I drove home through the snow with nothing but clear road ahead of me. I was not happy exactly. I was settled. There's a difference, and it matters.